Good. So I'm Erica Frank. I'm your chair, and this is what we're going to be talking about for the next bit about greening Academe and whether we can all become a little brighter green. Um, what we're going to be talking about is really a fairly disruptive agenda. All of us, did our trainings in reasonably conventional kinds of institutions and did some trainings after that as well, which we were just talking about necessity being the mother of invention. But we're going to be talking about some novel ways to approach learning that have green implications. So these are your speakers today. This is me. I'm a physician and I'm a professor and Canada Research Chair here at UBC in Preventive Medicine and Population Health. And I'm also the founder of NextGenU, which I'll be talking with you about a bit. And Peter and Evan and Seth are going to be introducing themselves as well when they come up to speak. Welcome, glad you're here. Hi. So these are the things we're going to be talking about. This is from the program. I hope this is what you signed up to hear. So about carbon-free and cost-free education and academic pension funds that are low carbon, about how to travel less as an academician and to see some examples of that. And there'll be time for your questions and your initiatives. And if you don't have enough by then, at 10 o'clock, we're going to be talking more about how to fly less, specifically how we can start. I've been pushing for this for the decade plus that I've been here at UBC, but how we can be pushing even more for that. So that's what's on our plate. Management of potential bias. I've been employed full-time by UBC since 2006. I've volunteered for NextGenU since I invented it. And because I'm going to be talking about these pension funds, you should know I put my money where my mouth is, and that's where I have my US pension too. And I'm trying to do this at UBC, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. So again, going to talk about NextGenU, lower carbon pensions, and then we're all going to talk about a bar graph that changed my life, but we'll come back to that. I want to ground us first with a picture that I took this morning. So this is my academic building, the School of Population and Public Health, and I designed the exterior of this. This was the Library Processing Center until 8-ish years ago. It was a Soviet-era brutalist concrete building with some ribbons of glass going across it, which was, it's an okay look. There's a lot of that at UBC, though. But I really love carbon sequestration in wood, right? Because I think it's a beautiful and incredibly sustainable way to sequester carbon. And so we created this exterior for the School of Population and Public Health that has a huge 20-foot long salvaged timber as a table and then matching pieces as benches with a extended overhang. They just wanted to have a regular overhang on it, but I said, why don't we make it a 15-foot overhang? And it's glass, so you can see the rain coming down. And there are plugs underneath that table. And of course, the steel beams slightly akimbo are an allusion to trees. There's obviously premier bike parking. And we now have a little food garden, including some fruit trees growing out front too. So this is what I was able to do in our front yard by being a faculty member at UBC at a time where we were moving into this new building. So what I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about is NextGenU. And this is, in essence, the world's first free university. We are the world's first portal to free accredited higher education. And I invented NextGenU in 2001. And I'm going to be telling you some about it for a few reasons. But at this particular talk, I really want to concentrate on this reason, the low carbon emissions piece of it. Sorry, I'm a fading laser. Okay, yes, so the low carbon emissions piece of it. Because this is a characteristic that NextGenU shares with massive open online courses and shares with the revolution of being able to do online education. So the thing that most people concentrate on is this piece, though. We are uniquely in the upper right-hand corner for credit for free. We are being used in 193 out of 195 countries around the world, every place but North Korea and South Sudan. It's available in 103 languages through the magic of Google Translate. And these are the courses we're currently offering, including, which I'll talk about in some detail in a moment, the master's degree in public health, which is the world's first free degree. We've just gotten full US accreditation for this, and we're launching it this summer. We've been piloting it in Texas and around the world, but we're launching it this summer in Texas at the newest medical school, and also in 10 Caribbean states with the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. And probably also this summer in Asia, in probably 10 countries in Asia as well. So that's our holy grail, was creating the world's first free degree. And as of 2 weeks ago, we're there. So these are our founding collaborators and funders. And I want to show you a little how we did it and what it is, because, okay, that's nice to say it's the world's first free degree, but what actually am I talking about? Because if anybody wants to go home and start using this, you need to understand its credibility. So these are our founding collaborators and funders. Our first grants came from the World Health Organization. The only one that's probably not familiar to you is the Annenberg Physician Training Program. And we have a $20 million endowment from them as of 3 years ago to sustain this work. So we're here to stay as an entity. In particular, I wanted to spend a moment showing you the master's degree in public health, but we also have available, you can see on the site, a med school in a box, full preventive medicine residency, and coming soon, a master's in health administration, a bachelor's of science in nursing, and pre-health sciences training. So if you want to learn more about the MPH, there's the QR code and a tiny URL. But this is the basic curriculum. It has the regular core courses for it, and sample electives are shown there, and then there's a practicum as always. It's created in a competency-based way with advisory group review and includes mentored and peer-related activities for skills. We create them by matching existing competencies and resources and organizing them into modules. And again, the MPH just got US accreditation. We're going to be starting it quite large scale next month, and have the core courses ready and many electives ready now and more to come shortly. So those are the specific core and related courses. This is what a typical course, those are the 9 courses that were sponsored by the US Centers for Disease Control, probably the leading organization in terms of public health and public health education in the world, other than WHO. This is what a typical course homepage looks like, with the description of the course, the co-sponsors at the top, on the left, a table of contents, and on the right, access to discussion groups and mentor and peer activities, to quizzes, to resources, and to the full syllabus. So these briefly are those 9 courses: environmental health, biostats, epidemiology, social and behavioral sciences, health policy and management, program evaluation, knowledge translation, global health, and nutrition and public health. And all of those are either already posted or will be posted by the end of this summer for anyone, any place, to be able to take any individual course for free for credit. So that's available for y'all to take home and use with your various constituencies. And these are the co-sponsors, as I mentioned, that we have on this. Oh, and I can now add WHO. We got official, finally, signature of a memo of understanding 2 weeks ago as well. So these are the remarkable organizations that provide credibility to these. As I mentioned, there's a preventive medicine residency, even we've gone all the way up to graduate medical education. So let me just show you a moment about evaluations, both evaluations of our students and evaluations of NextGenU as an entity. And this research is what I do for my job at UBC. Much of what I do is studying the efficacy of whether or not this new disruptive technology and educational methodology works. So in terms of evaluations of the courses, students are able to evaluate the learning objects, the peer and mentored activities, and be evaluated by their peers and their mentors. And then there's also objective evaluation with multiple choice quizzes after each module and a final exam. They can rate each resource and suggest alternatives. This is a peer exercise of creating multiple choice questions. This is a bank that we draw from to review and supplement our database with. We try to have students do useful things like writing a letter to the editor and actually submitting it after they've had it reviewed by their peers and their mentors, for example. And in our climate change and health course, we have, in fact, them doing exactly such an exercise, either submitting a letter to the editor to a journal, a scientific journal, or to their local papers. So this gets students in the business of becoming activists as well as scientists. Quizzes after each module, final exam that's timed. We have great assessment security. We can videotape students taking the exams. We can freeze their cut and paste functions. We can look at any sites that they access while they're taking the exams, and we can also print exams too. So just to show you a little data to conclude in terms of our efficacy. So these are studies that we did in the US, and then the bottom ones here in Vancouver at Simon Fraser University. The ones at the top are at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences in Bethesda, Maryland, the U.S. Military Medical School. And on the right, it's at Mizzou. And this is looking at the scores for the emergency medicine course that we offer from senior medical students at these 2 institutions. And you can see that for all 3 of these tests, that students had identical knowledge acquisition compared with previously traditionally trained medical students. And then on the bottom, this is here at Simon Fraser University for the environmental health course, for the core course for the MPH, identical student knowledge acquisition, and significantly superior student satisfaction. And how this course was taught, and this is the best implementation of this kind of course, is in a flipped classroom, where you have students do their didactics ahead of time, their book learning, which they do on NextGenU, and then they come to either a virtual classroom, or in this case, a real physical classroom, and you get to do some question and answer, and you do some field trips. So, and with that configuration, we had students preferring significantly this kind of training to a traditional classroom lecture-based approach. In Kenya, we did an intervention, and I'll close with data from this intervention with a $1.1 million grant from Grand Challenges Canada to develop educational programs to improve mental health through improving training of primary care providers and of community health workers. We found improvements in their understanding of how to treat substance use disorders, But even more importantly to me, and remarkably to me, than their improvements in knowledge and skills and behaviors, they also reduced their stigma. So they were less, this is a big problem, especially in low and middle income countries. And in Kenya, people are often drugged into submission or caged or chained if they have mental illness. There's huge stigma. And so the fact that we were able to, with an online course, reduce stigma in primary care providers and community health workers was, to me, a really positive outcome. The second really startling finding at the end of this was that essentially all of them preferred Next Gen U courses to traditional courses. And that, I would have thought that if they'd been given a choice of being able to be in a classroom in a traditional setting, they still chose that. So that was pretty neat. And then just some qualitative feedback. They felt that this is from the primary care docs, they felt that the information was competency-based indeed and applicable, and that they have this change in attitude. And from the patients in the randomized controlled trial, and this is my second to last slide on Next Gen U, and then just a little bit more on a couple of other small pieces to introduce our next speakers. This is qualitative data from patients. So able to send their kids to school because they stopped drinking and to feed them. And this is my favorite piece of qualitative data. This is a couple who came in for their 1-year follow-up with a baby in their arms, and they hadn't been able to conceive prior to that, and they were able to conceive, and they attributed that to having stopped drinking because of the study. So a really broad range of data that shows that this is efficacious and easy to adopt. So I will stop my Next Gen U disquisition here with this slide. This is all going to be available, again, thanks to Evan, on a YouTube channel. So if you want to review any of this, you can contact me or Evan. I'm glad to share that. And that also has my contact information, but Erica Frank at UBC. So let me talk to you for a moment about low carbon pensions. And again, we'll have plenty of time at the end to talk about all of these things and for you to talk about your innovations and to ask questions. So to lower carbon pensions. So I was the president of Physicians for Social Responsibility and on the board of PSR. You may know this organization because we shared the Nobel Peace Prize twice, once 2 years ago, and before that in the 1980s for our work on nuclear war and reducing the risk of nuclear war. So the second major area, though, that PSR works on, Physicians for Social Responsibility works on, is on climate change. And so as part of participating as an academician, scientist, advocate in PSR's work, I became very knowledgeable about climate change and concerned about climate change, and had all of my money in my pension fund at Emory, where I was until 2006, in the teachers, and this is an $800 billion fund in the United States. This holds essentially all of the teachers, university level teachers and librarians funds in it. So TIAA-CREF, I led a small campaign, took a couple days of my life, is it, to get them to offer this fund. And so before I started this, all they offered was TIAA-CREF Social Choice. And with an email saying, I'm coming to New York in a couple months. I'm the president of PSR. I really think you guys ought to offer a low carbon fund. And they said, yeah, we'd love to meet with you. And we had a great and open discussion. They'd already been thinking about it. And a year and a half later, after they went through all of the appropriate governmental processes, we had this fund, which now it's compared to their other funds, it's small, but it's $110 million that is now considerably less carbon intensive. So this wasn't a hard thing to do. I've been working since I came here in 2006 to get UBC to do this, and we don't even have a socially screened pension fund, much less a low carbon one, but we are, as of a few months ago, it looks like, finally on a path that may change that. So that's what I wanted to tell you about this piece. And then I'm going to close with, and have Peter come up next with this bar graph that changed my life. So this is the generic version. I'll come back to that in a second, but this is the version that applies to all of you right now, if you came from someplace else to here, right? So this is one flight versus everything else for a year of carbon footprint for flying. And seeing this completely changed my life. I've not stopped flying. With NextGenU, it is really difficult, but I do things like go to 11 countries in 14 days in a loop, and try to only do that, once or maybe twice a year, as opposed to most of my academician colleagues who fly without much of a thought to anything besides funding and time. And so this really brings it home to me. I presume most people in this room are already woke around this, but this is, if it's not already interpretable, this is what the climate budget is for a less than 2 degrees centigrade rise per person, this dotted line here. And then these green bars are the countries that fall pretty much within or below that. The orange countries are those that are above it, including this world average. And then here we are, Americans and Canadians and both. And my footprint is huge because this is for one round trip flight from Vancouver. This is the carbon footprint. So this weighed so heavily on me when I saw it, and the next Christmas I didn't fly back to Atlanta for Christmas, and it just started this very deliberate path for me. So this is the generic one, just to end on that for the moment, and for you to do these calculations from wherever you are. And with that, I will, yeah, of course. Yep. Yeah, and you can, yes, you see the URL, and then Barry Saxifrage, hence saxifrage.org, lives here in Vancouver, and he has this amazing site that has all sorts, it used to be called Visual Carbon, that has all sorts of climate change and flying data on it. Great.
Hello, I'm Peter Shepard. I'm a passive house builder and board member of the Environmental Studies Association of Canada. And today I'd like to talk to you about 3 low-carbon conference formats that ESAC is deciding between. So first I'll give a rationale for the shift, and then look at the 3 formats. So to start, here's a cartoon of about the airline's response to the EPA announcement in 2016 that CO2 endangers human health. It inspired me to calculate the number of suitcases it would take to hold all the carbon, the CO2 from my flight, my return flight from Toronto to Vancouver. And the cartoonist said it made his day when I posted this on Twitter. It was sort of fun. This is the Washington Post cartoonist. So this graph illustrates an implementation gap in the industry's plan to reduce their emissions. And beyond this gap, there's a credibility gap in that for 1.5C target, we're supposed to be net zero by 2045. So this, you'll notice the lower line there stops at, I think, at 400 megatons or something. So they still think it's normal in 2040 to be putting out um, far too much carbon. So yeah, consumption-based carbon budget approach reduces regional tension in Canada, because often people sort of pit producing regions against the regions that are more consumers. So if we take a consumption-based approach, then it's in that way it's much more equitable. And I so often wonder how aviation fits into our average profile. So then I worked out, on average, we put out about 18 tons per capita, a minimum, 18 to 20, so I think 22, that's Brett Dolter and Peter Victor, say that's our consumption-based budget. So at that rate, we put out 700 kilograms a week. So if you had to put that out in recycling bins, the most typical size, we'd all be putting out 1 kilometer worth of bins, 1,600 bins every 2 weeks to deal with our CO2. So yeah, I pay for carbon offsets, mostly so that I know how much more carbon I'm adding to that weekly rate. And then so zooming in on this slide, this is from Atmosphere, which is a German company that does very good numbers if you do a particular flight. So you can see I paid 25 euros or $36 Canadian for the ton of CO2 I'll be putting out to get back and forth to this conference. Now imagine if, in addition to picking up your checked luggage, you had to pick up all your CO2 from flying when you got home. So if you put all the CO2 from my flight, that's 1 ton into suitcases, that's like 559 liters per kilogram. So if you work it out, it would be almost 6,000 large suitcases. This is actually, I have an ugly suitcase just like this one, and mine is slightly bigger, but that's a 100-liter suitcase. So you basically have 100 kilograms of ice in each suitcase. You'd be picking up about 6,000 of them for your 1 ton. And if, it would be 600 suitcases of carbon dioxide as a gas, but for every ton of CO2 that's put out, 625 tons of ice will melt over the next 10,000 years. And this is fairly accepted in climate science, those who do study glaciology and carbon dioxide's long tail. And this is a scientist who I took the number from and extrapolated the number of suitcases. He's quite famous. He's at the Carnegie Institute. And then just to picture that same volume of ice, this is our, we're getting a renovation to our house. We have a 2.5-story brick house. That block of ice that will be melted from the 1 ton from me flying back and forth would fill our entire house, including the basement. So that's the scale of 625 cubic meters of ice. And it would cost, I called up about 4 different ice making companies in Ontario. And also I know the co-founder of Passive Buildings Canada is an engineer who works for Toronto Hydro, and he does payback calculations for companies wanting to make their machines more efficient. So if he was working for like an ice making company, the most efficient machine is like has a freezer has a coefficient of performance of 2.5. So I worked it out at 15 cents a kilowatt hour. It would cost $4,000 at a wholesale rate to make the amount of ice that my flight will melt. So then, in fact, as far as I can see, minimum your per ton cost of CO2, if you were to restore the ice, would be a minimum $4,000. And even that doesn't take the heat out of the Earth as a system. So it to me, after I did that calculation, I sort of realized carbon waste is effectively like kryptonite. It's an unpriceable good. Or the climate stability it provides us, it's effectively an unpriceable good, because even if you made that ice, 60% of the energy that you save by using a freezer is still in the Earth's atmosphere. Okay, so now that I've covered the rationale for flying less, here's the 3 formats I've been looking at. The first is the cheapest and easiest, the nearly carbon neutral format from the University of California, Santa Barbara. It's based on pre-recorded and live talks with asynchronous exchange of questions via WordPress. The second is Around the World Conference in the University of Alberta. They've been holding them since 2013, and it's more technically sophisticated. It's a multi-hub hybrid model with both streaming and video conferencing. Streaming and video conferencing. And the third is a conference that happened on Music Perception last year, the semi-virtual conference format. It was innovated by an academic in Austria, and I'll leave that one to Evan, who will cover it in much more detail. So the first format, the nearly carbon neutral format, is from the University of California. They've had 5 conferences since 2015, typically involving many countries at a time. And then there's also a petition that goes along with that format from the Flying Less blog. And there's a very similar set of asks for academic associations. So for all the academics in the room, if you could go to that website and just sign up, then they're very gentle asks. They're just sort of asking, ask your universities, ask your scholarly associations to just start to account for your carbon. So it's not asking for like a moratorium or personal accounting. It's just to do it from an organizational level. So the way this format works is instead of flying to a conference, a nearly carbon format asks that speakers film themselves giving a talk for 15 to 17 minutes. You take part in the online Q&A, and then only registered participants can take part in the Q&A. You view as many talks as possible, asking questions of your own to the speakers. And there's a 3-week-long comment period where presenters ask questions, and they actually have got far more feedback because of that asynchronous quality to it. And the videos in Q&A are permanently posted in public. Then there's actually a nearly carbon neutral happening next week. If anybody's curious, it's open access and there's no registration fee, but you do have to register. So yeah, if you go to the Flying Less blog, you'll get a note about that. And then, so here's the format evaluation criteria I made up. So it's looking at carbon reduction at an equitable science-based rate, increased access and equity, maintaining feel of an in-person conference, providing networking opportunities via Q&A engagement or other, and then cost and technical complexity. Evan will get a little bit more into that on that one conference. So here's just very quickly, here's some pictures of the second format from University of Alberta. This is the Around the World format. They've taken place since 2013. These are the that's 2014. And then, yeah, you'll notice the 2015 version conference on the left had 15 international hubs. And then, yes, here's the last 2 years. And then here's the third format, which I won't cover in any detail. This is just the cover page for the musicologists at the semi-virtual format. So sort of in conclusion, the nearly carbon neutral is the least carbon, it's the fastest to replicate. It doesn't require complicated video conferencing or expensive software. So it's more stable that way. It has a proven track record, and it hosts international hubs. It has 0 registration costs, which enable equity. The Around the World from the University of Alberta has had 6 since 2013, many hubs at a time, has 2-way video conferencing at minimal cost. It's a practical format for a small organization like ESAC, but it would still require institutional support. The semi-virtual conference from the University of Graz and Concordia, it offers higher quality multi-hub 2-way video conferencing. It's a little more technically demanding from what I can see than the other formats, but it's still much cheaper than 100% conventional single hub conference. The carbon and cost reduction depends on the number of hubs, and there's a detailed guide for viable implementation. If you can get institutional support, it would take that bit. So here's my rough spreadsheet, which I can go into during a question period, which I've started to make up to compare the hubs, just all the different things that go into it. This is very preliminary. But I'll leave that to later because it's quite detailed. And so, yeah, in conclusion, the nearly carbon neutral format meets the science-based targets very readily. It's the cheapest, most accessible, and scalable format. It doesn't attempt to replicate in-person communication at all via video conferencing. And then the last two formats, the around the world and the semi-virtual, may be the most attractive to Congress as they're the closest to duplicating a traditional format. This is a big plus for participants attached to in-person contact, yet wanting a near zero carbon option to keep our planet habitable. And now I guess I'll turn it over to Evan. Thanks.
So hi everyone, my name is Evan Montpellier. I'm an associate researcher at the Topological Media Lab at Concordia University in Montreal. And last year I also served as the technical director of the ICMPC 15 ESCOM 10 conference, which is actually a joint meeting of two big international music cognition organizations. And so we implemented this semi-virtual conference format quite successfully for this conference, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the specifics of that format today. So the semi-virtual conference format was developed by one of the members of ESCOM, Richard Parncut, Dr. Richard Parncut, and some of his colleagues at the University of Graz in Austria. And it's an attempt to synthesize the benefits of traditional conferences with the advantages of virtual ones. There was a recognition from the people working on developing this format that there is a critical need for ecological reasons to move away from flying so much, and that there are also benefits to be gained in terms of accessibility and diversity from having a digital element to conferences. But at the same time, they also felt strongly that it was important to preserve the in-person aspect of face-to-face conference meeting that comes with traditional conference format. Richard Parncut observed at one point in his notes that that's really what inspires academics to do some of their best research. And of course, there are all the benefits of collegiality that come along with actually getting to meet people in person. So each hub, essentially in this format, acts of which there are an arbitrary number of geographically distributed hubs, sort of acts as a traditional conference in its own right. So at each university that participated in ICMPC 15 ESCOM 10, we had local activities, presentations, panels, workshops, keynotes that all functioned as they ordinarily would. And in addition to that, all of the hubs were linked digitally as much as possible. I'll get into the specifics of how that worked in a minute. In general, as has somewhat been covered already by Erica and Peter, virtual conferences have a number of advantages, the biggest one from an ecological standpoint being the reduction in the carbon footprint. There's also the fact, as I mentioned, that allowing digital participation in conferences makes them more affordable and accessible, which in turn allows for a greater diversity of participants in conferences, and that in turn increases the networking opportunities, since you'll be able to have academic interchange with colleagues and institutions who you might otherwise not be able to meet due to reasons of geographical distance, for example. Another benefit is the fact that you can run these events across multiple time zones in parallel, which means that you can have a very densely scheduled event. At our conference, we started at 6 in the morning UTC and ran until midnight, which meant that within 5 days, we were able to pack an enormous amount of material in. Some might have said too much. But the nice thing about these formats is that typically everything is documented with video, so it's all available post facto online. And if you miss an event that you really want to participate in, you can always go back and watch the documentation. Specific to the semi-virtual conference format, there are a few additional advantages, the largest being the fact that the experience of a traditional in-person conference is preserved. So you still get to meet colleagues and hang out, get to know people in a way that's difficult to achieve with a totally virtual format, I believe, at this point. One side benefit of the fact that the individual hubs are a little bit smaller, that was pointed out by somebody surveyed after the fact, is that it makes for a more intimate feel. So while you might not get to meet as wide of a range of international colleagues in person, those who are at any given hub will have a bit more time to socialize and get to know each other and their work. And last but not least is the fact that this format, because it's still somewhat traditional, is less technically risky than going with a totally digital conference format. If the internet were to completely go down for whatever reason, at whatever scale, you'd still have a conference in a basic sense. So that's it as well. There were a couple of challenges that we heard some feedback on after this conference happened. One of them was the aforementioned dense schedule was a bit overwhelming for some participants. There's always the issue of having too many interesting events to attend at any conference, and so much the more so when there are 4 conferences all happening in parallel. I'll show you also a screen grab of one of the schedules for the day, and you'll see that it's a bit technical. Some people found it a little bit hard to navigate in a way, but I think that with good information design could be mitigated. And the other issue that I'd say still needs a lot of development is the simulation or encouragement of casual communications between digitally remote hubs. In the case of our conference, we tried an approach that we called the global foyer, which essentially involved setting up computers with live video streaming connections in sort of lounge spaces at the different hubs, with the notion being that people could sit down between events and have a coffee and chat with somebody in Graz or La Plata or Sydney. In reality, the experience of talking to somebody who's actually right there in person in front of you is just that much more compelling. So people tended to gravitate to that, and the digital global foyer connections tended to be a little bit ignored. I think in future, this could be improved possibly by having a higher degree of structure or facilitation, or maybe by using some novel technologies like you could try something with VR or AR, but it's still a region to be explored somewhat. So speaking specifically about this conference, ICMPC 15 SCOM 10 happened from July 24th to 28th of last year. It was the very first implementation of this format, so everything was a little bit experimental, but it all worked out pretty well in the end. And it ran between these 4 hubs, so one in La Plata, Argentina, one in Sydney, Australia, the University of Graz in Austria, and Concordia in Montreal. Across these 4 hubs, we ran a total of 119 local sessions, most of which were comprised of hour or hour and a half long presentation blocks. We also had a number of workshops and keynote events that were linked across all of the hubs. So out of those 119 sessions that we ran, 110 of them were connected in some way digitally. And a little over half of those were sessions that were really virtually connected in real time, allowing for a live Q&A. The other slightly less than half were rebroadcasts, meaning that we would play whatever the recording was for an audience after the fact. So there wouldn't be a Q&A. Usually this was for reasons of impossible to overcome time zone differences, but we were still able to have a version of the talk shown at each hub after the fact. And we also did have some purely local events, mostly just poster sessions, which would be complicated to live stream. You can maybe do it with a roving camera, but we didn't bother trying that. Here's a page of the schedule. So it's a little bit hard to read right off the bat, you can see, because it is quite dense. But in general, it's organized in the vertical according to the site, according to the conference hub. Going from the bottom, it's Sydney, then Graz, then La Plata, and then Montreal. And across the top, you can see the time in UTC. You can see it really did start first thing in the morning. It's basically 6 o'clock, Sunday 7 o'clock UTC, and ran all the way until midnight. And you can see the time zone shift across this as we go from the morning in Sydney and Graz to the evening in La Plata and Montreal. So at Concordia, we handled all of this content with a number of rooms. We had 2 what we called local presentation rooms, where presentations like this would happen, and those presentations would be streamed out. I'm actually streaming this presentation using the same setup, essentially, that we ran for that conference. So you can see it's not very complicated. I just have a laptop here. In addition to those 2 local rooms, we also had 4 remote streaming rooms where we were able to receive talks that were being live streamed from elsewhere or play the rebroadcasts from previous talks. We also had an auditorium to hold keynotes. We had a poster area, the global foyer, which served as a computer lab as well. And we ran all of this with a paid staff of 13 technicians and 12 hospitality people. These were staff that were hired specifically for the conference. So Concordia has its own IT department, but because we had somewhat specific needs, we found it was necessary to hire and train people specifically in the conference format. In terms of the tech, it's not actually that complicated to run one of these things, and it is a bit modular, so depending on your budget and the access to equipment that you have through your institution, you can adjust. But the core of what we were using was a piece of software called OBS. It's a free and I believe open source application that's received a lot of development, mostly through interest in the live streaming gaming community. So it's very stable, it's quite easy and straightforward to use. And this would allow us to composite all of our video feeds, of which we had the PowerPoint presentation, as well as webcams for the audience and the presenters, together into a stream. We were also able to add in audio from microphones for the presenter and the audience. And because this was a music cognition conference, we needed to incorporate examples of audio played back from presenters' computers. And all this was very ably handled by OBS with no appreciable glitches. So considering the fidelity that was needed for this particular discipline, that was impressive to me. We streamed this directly to YouTube Live. And so the audiences at the remote sites would tune in to a YouTube live stream and watch as presentations were given. YouTube streaming does have a bit of latency, so it doesn't work on its own for handling a Q&A. There's just too much lag. So when we got to the Q&A at the end of each presentation, we would switch to a video conferencing application called Zoom. It's essentially marketed as a sort of business version of Skype. In testing, we found that it was a little bit more stable and had slightly better fidelity and latency than Skype or Hangouts. But again, depending on budget considerations, you could use any number of video conferencing platforms with little problem. Zoom is actually quite affordable. So I think it's about $15 to $25 a month, depending on your needs. So no-brainer, and a lot of institutions would already have it licensed. As you can see here, this is a slide showing what the costs would have been per room if we had bought all the equipment outright. So the biggest cost for sure would be the laptops and then the microphones if we had to buy everything out of hand for the conference. We had the luxury of being in a music department, so we had access to a lot of really nice audio gear. But again, a lot of institutions will have quite a bit of this equipment hanging around and available. So it's just a question of negotiating things with your IT department. And our real costs were quite a bit lower. The main thing that we spent money on was really the staff. For a 5-day conference, we spent $13,500 on technicians and hospitality people. But if you break that down on a per room basis, it works out to, the technical costs work out to about $200 a day. And that's for, again, from 6 in the morning to 12. So that's 18 hours essentially worth of person time. Depends on what we hired students for this, so we were paying whatever the standard Concordia rate is. This depends on what your institution's policies are around that. Yes. No, I believe that it's just a fixed license fee. Yeah, the software is really cheap. I mean, as I mentioned, OBS is totally free. Zoom is essentially negligible. YouTube live streaming is also a free service. So yeah, the costs are really, really low in that department. I would say also, just in terms of the staff costs, that it's worth bearing in mind that a conventional conference will have to hire staff anyway at a certain level. It's important to have AV staff. Again, we would have had lower AV costs if we had just gone with the Concordia in-house AV technicians. But because of the particularities of this format, we found it was worth rehearsing with our particular people for this thing. This is something that I'd like to suggest in general as a strategy going forward for this, though, is that rather than implementing this conference format or whatever digital or semi-digital conference format on an ad hoc basis, I think it would be really great if organizations such as this one could encourage host institutions to start to adopt the methodology at an institutional level so that it's just sort of in place and ready to go. Just to finish up the slide, we did have a few equipment costs, fairly low, but these were things that Concordia didn't have in-house that they could provide us with. We needed to grab video from presenters' computers into whichever laptop we were using for streaming. So in each room where we were doing the streaming out, we would have 2 laptops, one that was just running the PowerPoint, and then the video from that would be sent to a second computer that was streaming to YouTube Live. And this simplified the process of running the presentations, basically. It allowed the technicians to handle the YouTube streaming independent of the presenters, so there was no need to jump on and grab a computer away from anyone. Dr. Parncut and his colleagues did a survey and collected some data after the conference ran and found a few pieces of information that are salient for the criteria that Peter mentioned. The most notable one for this particular presentation is that, on average, carbon use was reduced by 70% per participant from this format. So that was a huge benefit, of course. We also noted that there was a 50% increase in attendance, quite good. And 61% of attendees approved of the format. It's not universal acclaim, but definitely a clear majority. I would probably put this number down to the fact that there are certain things that you have to compromise on and give up if you shift away from a totally traditional conference. You don't get to spend time with absolutely all of your colleagues that you might otherwise in person. But as mentioned, some of the other benefits do sort of, I think, outweigh this trade-off. It's something that maybe just needs to be accepted in terms of the benefits that come from the format. And also, as I know, this is the first time that this format has ever been tried out, so of course there were a few bumps and scrapes along the way. But from a technical standpoint, I would say we did quite well, even though we were really trying all of this out for the first time. Probably 99% of the presentations streamed with no problem, and the issues that we had might have been down to minor human error type glitches. Just to wrap up, because the session today is on career possibilities in part, I wanted to mention that this format does promise, again, to reiterate, increased networking opportunities with a large diversity of international colleagues and institutions. Of course, the lowered barriers to attendance from lower travel costs and attendance costs are a nice touch as well. And then for those people like me who are interested in implementing these formats, there's some interesting career possibilities in terms of actually running these conferences and developing the format further. If you're interested in finding out a little bit more about the format, I don't have the URLs up here, but any of these in Google, any of these terms should bring up the relevant YouTube links or the conference website itself. And I would be happy to talk to anyone after the presentation if you'd like more info. That's all. Thank you.